Our next speaker, Tristan, is from Perth. What up? Yeah, there's a lot of us. There's more than you think.
More than I thought.
Yeah. So Tristan is from Curtin University. He is an academic and a software engineer who enjoys using and teaching Apple tools and frameworks to others, as well as using software technologies to solve problems in the real world. I have been working with Tristan on a project for longer than it was meant to be. And I can tell you one of his key skills, I think of him as a little bit like sort of an academic whisperer. So he kind of bridges I'm on like the technical side of this project, and he bridges between me to the academic side of the project and helps people to make better decisions than they might without his help. So top bloke. And I'm really looking forward to what he's going to share with us today about SwiftUI. So please make him feel welcome.
Oh, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. It's great to see so many faces. As someone who's been to one in-person dev world pre-COVID and sort of been around the trap, so to speak, for a few years now and sort of participated in every world, it's great to be back. It's great to be up here now that I have something worthwhile, at least that I think, to talk about. And it's great to be back in Melbourne, honestly. It's nice to be able to travel again. Before I do get started, I would like to pay respect to the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, especially pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank my colleague David McMeekin. The two of us work quite closely together. Unfortunately, it's just one of the two of us here today. You're stuck with me, but certainly he contributed certainly a lot, probably more than myself, to this project. So his contribution shouldn't be minimized. You're probably seeing that the U there is highlighted, and you probably think that I, pasted something in and forgot to remove a link or something like that. But no, I highlighted that U to sort of say the purpose of this talk was to sort of go back a bit to the old U in AUC. I know we're told now by Tony it's AUC and nothing else, but certainly having a look at the program today, I thought it would be nice to sort of talk about something from a bit of a university point of view rather than an industrial point of view, let's say. Not that there's anything better or worse in one or the other, but rather I thought we'd bring it back to our traditional sort of home, so to speak. So today I'm here to talk about the highs and lows of teaching SwiftUI, which was something I came up with thinking about what I've been doing over the last few years. And certainly SwiftUI is a very different way of doing things if you spent time in the Storyboards UI kit world. But there's lessons, I think, for all of us here, even those who don't teach, but certainly for those who work with people who don't necessarily work directly in a code base, but work adjacent to it. The ability for even these sorts of people to have a bit of knowledge about how things are built, I think certainly can make projects run a bit smoother. And I certainly do think as well that SwiftUI can make it easier for people to sort of get in and learn how to build native apps. I will apologise if I fall asleep. I got in a really late flight this morning. It was delayed, but hopefully the rest of today's presentation will go off without a hitch. So briefly, to go back to a bit of background on how I sort of started with all this. Back in early 2019, that time known as pre-COVID, if we can believe such a thing exists after so long, David and myself started up a series of 3 MOOCs on the edX platform, which is the one that we're part of as Curtin University. And the whole idea behind it was to get people who aren't necessarily developers interested in a little bit of coding. And there's many reasons for that, of course. It's nice to encourage new people to be developers. Some people may disagree, but I think certainly the more the merrier, that's for sure. We all have ideas, we all have different perspectives. But with apps and programs and just computing in general becoming such a large part of everyday life, business, leisure, you name it, it's good for people to have an understanding about how things are made. I'm sure many people here who are developers day to day, I don't spend all my time developing, spend most of it doing teaching and research, but of course you do need to know what you're teaching, or at least I'd like to think you do need to know what you're teaching. It's not always the case. It it pays to know how these things are built, how you can use them to solve problems, rather than sort of having some sort of manager tell you to, solve the Earth. Let's build a rocket to Mars and we can do it by next week. Certainly our friend from Twitter is known for making those sort of technological promises where we are expecting this much and end up with the tiniest bit in the end. So we started these 3 series of 3 separate MOOCs, small little online courses, 6 lessons in each, and they all sort of had related but slightly different focuses with them. The first one was an intro to iOS development, and that really just went through the basics of building interfaces with originally UIKit and a bit of the programming background behind that, things like variables, data types, control flow if statements, loops, that kind of thing. Take people who've literally never looked at a line of code before, and they could probably make something a little basic using GUI storyboard interface builder, but nothing, not the next Mastodon client or anything like that. We pivoted a little bit into SwiftUI in that one, but I do put it in quotes, as certainly our first go in moving into SwiftUI was probably, to be honest, token at best. It was really just to get a bit of taste out there for people. And that was really as much for us as it was for them. Certainly in the first couple of versions of SwiftUI, without wanting to be too disparaging, the sort of feature parity with what you've got in UIKit, there was a lot to be answered for. Things are certainly getting better over the years, I think, but there's still a case of saying that not everything that you would like to be there is there, and accessibility is one thing which, things are getting better, and, I don't want to take away from the team before me who talked about it with so much more eloquency than I probably can, but you can see that there are some modifiers and things you can add to your SwiftUI elements in there, but it would be nice to have more things that aren't quite there yet. We then moved on to working with the web and augmented reality. Augmented reality is certainly a bit of a buzzword these days, but there are certainly a lot of legitimate and quite useful use cases for it and things that you see in practice. And it's one of those things that people can get started with really easily, and certainly even throughout the journey here with the teaching I've been doing, Apple's released new tools where you can pretty much build an augmented reality app without writing a line of code. And of course, bridging that sort of gap between the real and the virtual is very much more of an art than a science. So the people who are probably more experienced in the artistic side of things can get into that a lot more easier. Finally, the last one we looked at was development from start to finish. So the things around programming, which is probably something that we don't always consider, is that there is more than just writing code development. There's testing, there's maintenance, there's project management. Some of these things may be the bane of our lives, some of them may not. There is considerations such as accessibility, as marketing, as deployment for different devices, ensuring that your interface works with different orientations and different resolutions. And quite often that can sort of get lost in the noise. So a lot of that course was really focusing on the things around development itself rather than the development itself. Without wanting to toot my own horn too much, we've had about 150,000 people pass through it, for better or worse. Generally, positive feedback. You certainly can't please everyone. And certainly some people do expect that a free or very low-cost course, they're getting champagne taste on a beer budget, but we do our best to help as much as we can, given the constraints of the rest of our life. So where does SwiftUI come in? Where does my speech about teaching SwiftUI all come in? So late 2021, right in the middle of COVID there, we'd obviously built this course back in 2019, and as we know, and as Tom said this morning, we have that TikTok release cycle. And every year in June, new software is released, new OS, new Xcode, new SDK. Sometimes things don't change much, especially on the basic side of things. Sometimes everything changes. And of course, especially when the things that you're trying to show people, such as how to use an editor such as Xcode and the tools within it, when that changes majorly, you'll have to obviously change how you teach that sort of thing. And the effort involved in creating learning materials is not small. So when it came to 2021, we really couldn't get away with sort of pushing it down the hill any further. So we decided it was time to update the materials rather than just sort of tweaking them at the edges. And in this case, we thought, well, it's probably a good time now to move towards SwiftUI. As sort of James said, you know, working with a project with James at the moment, and believe, without wanting to dob him in too much, he's been working in SwiftUI and enjoying it for the most part. Perhaps enjoying is not the right word, but it's fulfilling, let's say. So there is certainly power in SwiftUI. There's a bit of a learning curve, but it's also, I think, a very different way of thinking, but a way of thinking that can be applied to other sort of tech stacks, sort of getting 2-for-1 value out of what you learn. So rather than going and continuing to teach in UIKit, and of course with UIKit you can develop your interfaces in code, or you can develop them using the interface builder. SwiftUI, you're pretty much using code to do that, although you've got your canvas there that you can kind of interact with as well. So since we are teaching beginners, we're obviously going to go towards the simpler side of things, so going from that interface builder into having to write code. There's a fair few things there that did need to change, but the benefit of it was that when we considered that we wanted to turn this into an undergraduate unit at the university, we could use this material twice, once for the MOOC and once for the unit itself. So sort of, in a way, write once, deploy everywhere, but this case we're deploying to the MOOC and to the university. Of course, it's never a one-to-one thing. We go a bit further in some places for the internal students where we expect a little bit more difficulty and a little bit more investigation, where we sort of stick generally to more of the simpler things for our online learners on the MOOC. So how do we put it all together? Simply, we took what I would like to say greatest hits of at 1x, 2x, 3x, the 3 courses, and put it together to touch on the things which we thought were probably the most useful to people every day, and then adjust that into, where possible, SwiftUI, which in some cases was quite easy, saved a lot of time in development of resources compared to doing it the first time. It was a lot easier to teach and a lot easier for people to understand. Other times things got a bit messy, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Certainly I don't want to spend too much time talking about the pluses or minuses of SwiftUI. People have done that before. I think the last in-person dev world I was at, we had someone talk about SwiftUI, so no need to reinvent the wheel there. The idea being is that with these basic skills, you know, being able to gather and process data from the web, navigation between different views, introduction to user interface elements, and sort of a little bit of background in programming. Someone taking this course, either the in-person one or if they'd taken all 3 online, would be able to build something quite simple, and perhaps that might encourage them to undertake further study if they wish to go down the path of being a software developer, or at least have a better understanding about how the developers they may work with actually go and do their thing, so to speak. So the differences with SwiftUI, no more auto layout, thank heavens. I think anyone who's used storyboards in SwiftUI, the first thing they notice is that constraint-based layout is no longer the only way to organize things. There are certainly ways to go back in that regard if you really do like it, and some people do love the specificity, let's say, of auto layout. I, for one, was always driven mad by it. A lot of friends of mine who are developers for iOS were driven mad by it. So, for one, having a way to organize things on the screen or in the user interface that doesn't rely on specifying all these complex rules that relate to each other and have magic constants in them makes life a lot easier, both conceptually as to how we organize things, when we can just refer to them in terms of sort of the compass points and think about, you know, I'm putting something on the left or the right, the top, the bottom, adding some space, filling space. But of course, the downside of that is that you're trading off the ability to make things specific and very pixel perfect for things where, you know, good enough is good enough. You know, there are certainly still ways to pixel perfect sort of manipulate UI elements in SwiftUI, but if we're using things such as your H stacks, your spaces, your V stacks and all that, it makes it very easy to create a rough layout rather than the specific one. So probably your design team will get angry with you there by not being able to pixel perfect put in their designs. The other thing is this sort of concept of declarative, no matter how many times I say that, it's still a challenge, syntax. And the idea of sort of instantiating a UI component or even some other component, well, we're really talking about UI components here, aren't we? instantiating a UI component and then just applying functions to it to manipulate its state. So, I have a bit of text, make it green, make it big, make it this font. It's a different way from especially doing everything in a GUI, of course, where it's drag and drop and, going into the inspector and changing the properties. But even in terms of sort of developing interfaces in code with UIKit, where it's, I guess, somewhat similar in that you create something, store it in a variable and then change its properties. Everything in a line is something that certainly I found is quite conceptually easy for people to grasp. I have a thing, I'm doing this to it, then I do this to it, then I do that to that. It doesn't sound mind-blowing when you put it that way, but certainly my experience is that people find it's easier to understand what's happening when they sort of see everything one after another in a row. It's very self-descriptive. I mean, Swift is very good, certainly compared to the old Objective-C days, in, let's just say, not too verbose syntax, and certainly syntax that's quite readable for people, more on the English side of things in terms of programming syntax. Of course, one thing that we've noticed, certainly starting at the bottom, so to speak, and teaching in terms of people with very little programming background and then building things in SwiftUI, is knowing where to put functional code versus UI code. So of course, if you're sort of building using those basic app templates, you've got your view there and you implement it in your body, knowing where you should put things that don't really deal with the UI versus where things that do deal with the UI. Once you get that cemented down, it's quite an easy thing, but certainly starting up, all code is code, trying to sort of show people that this should go in a block or a closure sort of thing versus, this should just be plunked in with your UI elements. And of course, if, the code's in the wrong spot, your view won't render and you're back to square one. Now, of course, those things were the sort of relatively easy side of things. We also have the not so easy stuff, the lows, so to speak. So building very simple things, of course, we start off in terms of teaching at the bottom, building up from those basic views, basic controls, user interaction, adding a bit of logic. That stuff was relatively easy. It was easier to express it in SwiftUI, less lines of code, more logical lines of code. But when things moved into the not so easy stuff, that's where things got more complicated. So a couple of exercises we do is one's on image recognition using MLKit, and another one was ARKit, but not so anymore. Integrating these in a sort of SwiftUI way, certainly in these two camera-based apps, we looked into and I found two different ways to do them. There's probably more. One of them's using a UI view representable, which I think is sort of cheating. It's really just a bridge between UIKit and SwiftUI. But then one that was really powerful, but certainly conceptually quite difficult and also required quite a fair bit of code, was using Combine, which of course isn't SwiftUI exclusive, but it plays really nicely with it. So you can sort of implement a pub/sub pattern with that. We use that to sort of take in the information from the camera, process each frame, and then deliver the frame back to the user on the screen. So that was a great way to be able to analyze each frame and then work out, am I looking at a banana, am I looking at a hot dog, am I looking at a bamboo plant? So I guess the learning there is that there's not always one way to solve a problem. There are different ways, and it comes down to, I guess, really, do you want to take something that's easy or something that's sticking to the principles, religiousness versus reasonableness? Certainly I'm more of a pragmatic person and take the simple approach, but the simple approach isn't always the best approach. The more complex approach, certainly down the line, when you want to build upon it and learning those more complex skills and applying them elsewhere, there's certainly benefits to be had in that regard. So, although there was more of a learning curve for the students in terms of Combine, the ability to use that sort of pattern for other problems sort of negated the benefit there where, we could write it, in this case, in less lines of code using UI view representable, sort of bridging over to UIKit a little. But, I mean, there's plenty of opportunities there as well, but certainly the power of Combine, I think it's worthwhile spending that effort looking into it. Briefly, wouldn't be something about now, our first conference back here in person after COVID-19, without sort of a little bit about experience during COVID-19. And having had that MOOC background certainly did pay off when everything, especially in Western Australia, at times very rapidly turned from, doing things in person to lockdown, almost overnight. I think I remember once going down to Coles and, turning on the radio, and by the time I got home, I couldn't go out again. So having had the experience there building for an online platform certainly helped translate into a hybrid learning approach for internal sort of studies. Things that may seem simple and not technical as such are certainly not to be ignored. Things such as using good quality microphones, using good quality cameras. People do like quality experiences these days. It's certainly, the difference between something as simple as a good mic and a bad mic feels like you're in the room with someone versus you're listening to someone over a dodgy phone line 100 miles away. And certainly when we're physically apart, having, being virtually close together is quite a good thing, gets people into a good mindset and puts them in a good space to learn. So using some of those lessons, we adapted, bite-sized bits as videos online. Again, can deploy them to either one. But then, of course, some things such as, labs, they can be done online over video conference. It's functionally quite similar. But certainly, anecdotal feedback I've got from students is they do sort of prefer asking in person. They could still send things over email, but that sort of synchronous versus asynchronous type there makes things a bit different, and people sort of do like that personal touch and being able to discuss, work together in person. Certainly, unless everyone had huge multi-camera arrays so we could see exactly where you're pointing and things like that. So certainly, as I've hinted at before, the ease of using SwiftUI is not just in terms of development, although it is a bit of a learning curve for people who haven't used it before. Things have changed. We no longer really have auto layout. We have different ways to develop UI elements in quite a straightforward way. The logical nature of code, this is what I'm building, apply this to it. State variables, things like that. I think it's less of a learning curve to go from nothing to something compared to sort of the old UI kit way of doing things. But it is no silver bullet. But certainly, in terms of teaching people from nothing, it's made it easier for people to grasp concepts, and also easier in terms of the development of learning materials. There's less boilerplate code. There's just generally less code to achieve things in general. So of course, more time can be spent focusing on what each part does rather than going through all this boilerplate and things like that. Another thing is, simpler patterns, easier to write syntax. If I can do something in 10 lines and see an output and be really impressed by it, I'm going to be more likely to spend time learning more, developing more. And that was one that we received in feedback quite a bit, that students appreciated how easy it was actually to build something I can see. Whereas, a lot of the things they've studied, they've built command line interfaces, which are a bit less, for lack of a better word, exciting, not that they don't have their place. Another thing is that same sort of declarative syntax is used in a lot of other UI frameworks. There's a screenshot there peeking in from the Flutter docs. Flutter, React Native certainly build things such as components in a similar way. We can see the documentation there from React Native, from Flutter rather, and they've pretty much got a guide of how to go from Swift, if you're a SwiftUI developer, moving into the Flutter world if you want to develop cross-platform. And really it's just about the names of a few things have changed. There's a couple of things that are different here and there. But that general sort of pattern of building and componenterizing, for lack of a better word, your interfaces is still there. Really, React Native and Flutter are the two I'm most familiar with, but I imagine a lot of modern frameworks take this same sort of architecture. So learning the basics in one makes it more applicable to others. We never try and teach a tool or a language. It's more about the concepts behind it and being able to take those concepts and apply them into different toolkits and different languages, because these change all the time. jQuery was the big thing 10, 15 years ago. Now people barely ever talk about it anymore. Taking those sort of high-level skills and being able to apply them where appropriate is certainly something that I think is more desirable. Our focus in the course was primarily on the iPhone, for better or worse. There are, of course, different considerations to be made for different Apple devices. You have different shaped and different sized interfaces. The way you actually interact with them is quite different. Your watch is about there. Your TV might be on the wall behind us there, the glass wall. So understanding where we need to scale UI elements and how to use them in an appropriate manner always depends on where you want to use it at the end of the day. And we do consider that and do talk about it, but we don't really spend too much time developing, at least at this stage, for the watch or the TV. obviously the nature of the way you can build interfaces with SwiftUI, and I mean really you could with UIKit as well. Write once, deploy everywhere for all the different devices. A little bit more work perhaps for the watch and the TV, but as I have emphasized there, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Putting the same interface of an iPhone app onto an iPad, I'm sure we've all had those lovely apps where someone's literally just sort of ticked the box and said deploy to iPhone, and it does not take into account the fact that you've got all that extra screen real estate and just wastes it really on filling it with something that should be a column ends up taking up most of the screen. You're using these devices in different contexts. They have different functionality, different design considerations. So as much as you can write once, deploy everywhere, there should be sort of a consideration of the responsive nature of your app, probably talking to the choir here, of course, that it should adapt for these different interfaces. So briefly, just some examples of the various things we've done to sort of see in practice. So we've got, obviously, PowerPoint slides. We've built some AR apps, very basic there in my backyard, just using the built-in cube to prove a point of the code loading. Thankfully, our students are a bit more creative and have actually designed things themselves using the composer there. But there's been quite a lot that we've built together, and there's been quite a lot of good feedback as well from our students who've really enjoyed this. Of course, we don't just plonk code on a slide. It's explained line by line. We do talk about the theory behind it as well, but just the sort of different ways we have of learning there, through the different learning materials. Now, of course, SwiftUI is not the solution to everything. iOS applications are not the solution to everything. Mobile applications are not the solution to everything. Applications in general are not the solution to everything. It is just but one tool in the tool set. It is a very good solution to many problems that we see in this day and age, but it is not the solution to all of them. It certainly makes it a lot easier to prototype and build things, to get something simple, rough, up and running. Certainly in SwiftUI, I think, compared to building in UIKit, and especially going back to the days of Objective-C. But not everything is best solved as a SwiftUI application. Certainly, migrating that sort of storyboards-based AR and storyboards-based image recognition exercises into SwiftUI created more work than it took away. Reflections from us as teachers, certainly made our job easier, less complexity to deal with, less boilerplate code to deal with, to go through to people. We just focus on what's important. There's less noise in the brain to get confused about in simple terms. Certainly, some materials were more complex than others to be able to translate from UIKit into SwiftUI. A lot of them were a lot easier, and certainly doing that the first time around would have saved us a lot of time and effort. But of course, complexity, we try and avoid it, but sometimes it's unavoidable, and sometimes there are lessons learned from it. Some things such as auto layout, which we spent quite a lot of time trying to explain and probably not doing a great job at it, now no longer need to be taught, because we can use various SwiftUI elements to roughly position things, which is good enough for our purposes to be able to place things on a screen. So we can now spend that time that we would have taught that on focusing on other matters. And certainly other projects that we've worked with have shown that in SwiftUI you can run into some weird race conditions that crop up only in one version of iOS. And I see James is nodding there because he knows a little bit about that. Students, looking at the feedback we got, we ran the internal unit last year for the first time. We're running it again this semester. Thankfully, teaching is in the front half of the week, so I could take the red eye here today. A lot of our students also had studied Android Kotlin at the same time using Android Studio. And what they were amazed at is to do some things that would take them 4 separate Java files, 200 lines of code, could be done in 3 or 4 lines using SwiftUI. I think it was something just as simple as pulling some data off the web and sort of processing it. Certainly when you can use your built-in structure definitions in Swift to sort of create your data model for you and put it into that nice structure, it makes things a lot easier than on some other systems. Certainly a lot of students also appreciated that start to finish product lifecycle, how there's more to just development than writing the code itself. And also they appreciated having something they could actually show at the end of it, functioning apps, things they could interact with the GUI. Unfortunately, a lot of the basic programming stuff eschews the GUI because we're focusing on the programming constructs themselves, but that's not really that exciting for people. We do need those basics, but a lot of people don't really feel the excitement from it. So overall, SwiftUI, very different way to build interfaces compared to doing it with UIKit. Simple, effective. I think it's easier for people with no programming background to learn. And in this day and age, I think most people should, well, really everyone, if they can, learn at least the basics of how programs and apps are constructed, simply because they are at the heart of everything we do. Some things are easier, both to code and teach. Some things are harder to code and teach. Nothing is a silver bullet. But certainly I look forward to seeing DubDub this year, of course, announced this morning, what upgrades are brought to SwiftUI, and onwards and upwards, as they always say. It's certainly, I can't see it going backwards, that's for sure. So that's about it for me today. Thank you for having me. We've got a few minutes for questions, I believe, and then we've got something else planned.
Yes, thank you. In one of our brief lockdown periods, or a couple of them in Perth, I was teaching my daughters from home, and I thought I would do some app development stuff. They had done some kind of coding activities and games and things. I thought, let's teach them how to make a little app. And I hadn't really started with SwiftUI yet, so we were using storyboards and UIKit. And I felt like it really resonated to them that you know, you just drag these components onto the screen and you put them where you wanted, and then you kind of drag from them into the code, and you could, you know, modify them. It made sense to them. I haven't since then kind of gone back and shown them SwiftUI. Do you feel like, for someone totally new to this whole thing, do you feel like the storyboard approach resonates better or worse than you know, declarative code, where you write it all and you can kind of see what's happening as you write it, but you've got to write it first?
Now, great question, James. Of course, you got the microphone, so I don't need to repeat it. Previously, we had done a little bit of work taking this into high schools, and we went out into a remote community back in 2016 and taught an Indigenous school there, 200 k's out of Kununurra. And that was the one thing I noticed, is that the ability for people just to build things with storyboards was crazy. Just drag, drop, done. And they'd all come up with these really, really impressive storyboards, not having seen Xcode or anything like that before. Where I think the benefit of SwiftUI comes in is that it does sort of force you down that programming rabbit hole, for lack of a better word, in that all of these students, they would go and they create the storyboard, and then when it came time to actually, you know, link it up with their IB actions and things like that and actually write some code, they got a little bit bored. They didn't really find that as exciting as that sort of visual approach. Certainly, I think it's a great way to get people in, but I think the fact that you kind of have to write code certainly encourages people to, you know, they say, oh, I've done this is what happens, I'll go down that a little bit further.
Yeah, I think you're right, because, you know, like dragging in there and showing, look, in this little view did load thing, you can change those things you're dragging. You want to change the text or the color, that's where you do it. But when it came time to doing slightly more complex stuff with code, they were kind of all at sea. So you could be right that starting off with code bridges that gap a little more. I think we've got time for one more question, and then Tony's got something special with us.
Do you have a SwiftUI wish list? Things that you want that haven't been implemented yet?
That is a great question. And it's one of those things that I'm like, yes, of course there is. And now I'm thinking, but what? Look, probably a bit more feature parity with what's in UIKit. You know, certainly things aren't always as easy or necessarily possible to do in SwiftUI that you can do in UIKit. Things even such as, you know, event handler types are a bit more limited. How often do people use more than the sort of basic event handler types on controls is probably, you know, could be argued, but that's probably the area I'd most be interested in seeing more things made available, and perhaps we will see in June.
Who else? Out of interest, what's our sort of, so who has not touched SwiftUI ever, done nothing in SwiftUI? A couple of people. Who has kind of dipped their toes in, played a little bit, you know, explored it, and who's using it in earnest, you know, perhaps in a production app, or like really getting in there? Yeah, that's about the mix that I would have expected. I, like most things, I waited a few years till it felt a little bit more stable, and you know, there's more examples online, and
So you are just teaching SwiftUI for the undergraduate students, right? But unfortunately, currently, a lot of industry are still using UIKit.
Yep.
So how can they actually adapt after they graduate because of this gap of knowledge?
Very good question, and something that we considered at the same time as well is, of course, yeah, the UI kit is still probably by far in the previous installed base quite very popular, and probably 90% of projects out there, because of that long history, still run with it. Certainly we did talk to some industry partners, and they expressed an interest in people learning SwiftUI. Again, I don't think necessarily SwiftUI is the answer to everything, but I think a lot of people, even in industry and corporates, are interested in moving in that direction. But there are certain things holding them back, and I think one of those things is the knowledge and the experience of developers. So I think, if anything, teaching that SwiftUI can help bridge that gap. And even if people have learnt SwiftUI first and then they sort of go backwards and learnt storyboards again, sort of having pushed people down and kept encouraging them down that path of development, they might actually find it not as daunting to do things using storyboards, UI kit, rather than SwiftUI.